In this video, we're going to be diving into some essential layout concepts, being padding, margins, and gap spacing. This will really help you to build clean and responsive designs for your Bubble application. Let's dive into the editor and just get started. So I first want to talk about margins, and margins allow us to create space around elements, separating an element from another element. And on this page here, we have a dashboard page, which has a floating group header, a floating group sidebar, and then a group main content, which actually contains all of the page level content. And what you can see on this group main content, which I've selected, is that there is a left margin applied. And you can see that with this orange leader on the left. And the reason why we have this left margin is we want to ensure that the main content group doesn't actually slip underneath the floating sidebar. So because this sidebar is a floating group, that means that the height and the width doesn't affect the positioning of any of the page level elements, such as the elements within the main content group. And that's because this sidebar is either above or below the page itself. So that's why we want to add a margin. Similarly, we also have a top margin of 110 pixels over here. And the reason why we have this top margin is to make sure that there's distance between the main content group and the header itself, so that the main content group content isn't hidden by the header. And then finally, we have a margin on the right hand side of 60, which you can see over here. And the reason why we want to do that is we just want to have some space on the right side of the page to make sure that there is a balanced layout. What I want to do now is I want to open up this property editor, and just scrolling down here on the layout, we can see the margins that we have listed. And what I want to highlight is how we've actually calculated these margin values. So the left margin value is set to 345 pixels. And the way that's calculated is if I click on this sidebar, its max width is 285. If I add 60 pixels for visual space, that means that the left margin should be set to 345. Now with the top margin, that's 110 pixels. And if I click on this one, the height is 70 pixels, and then we want 40 pixels extra. And then the right margin is 60 pixels, and that's to create the buffer on the right hand side of the page, but also balance it with the left hand side of the page where we have that 60 pixel distance between the sidebar and the main content group. So it makes sure that there's a really balanced layout. So by measuring the width and the height of our floating elements, we can set the margins accurately. Additionally, something that we can do is we can set conditionals to adjust our margins for different screen sizes. So that just makes sure that our layout is responsive even on mobile devices. So if we look at how this one has been set up, what we can see in the property editor over here is that when our current page width is less than 1111 pixels, this is the width at which the sidebar is hidden and no longer visible on the page. So because that sidebar is no longer visible, we actually want to collapse that left margin from 345 to 40 pixels, and then again collapse our right margin from 60 pixels to 40 pixels as well. Because that sidebar isn't taking up any of the space and it's now hidden, we want to adjust this margin. So if I click over here, we can see that when the current page width is greater than 1111, that's only when this element becomes visible. So that's the relationship between the sidebar and us conditionally changing the margins. And this ensures that this main content group will have smaller margins when the sidebar is not visible. And it just makes sure that we have a clean and balanced layout even on a smaller screen width, such as on a mobile device. Next, let's explore padding. So padding creates space inside an element, pushing content away from the edges, and it's just highlighted in this light gray color in the editor. So right now we have a form group element with 40 pixels of padding on all sides. And this padding adds white space inside the group, making the content more readable and visually appealing. And you can just really easily adjust this padding value down the bottom to increase or decrease the white space. So if I change this to 100 pixels, you can see how that just affects the internal spacing of our group. And it just helps us to really easily refine the design and layout of our groups. Now, The next thing I want to talk to you about is gap spacing in columns. So if I click on this main form content, what we can see here is that there is a row graph of 20 pixels. And what that allows us to do, this gap spacing, is we set programmatically the amount of space between child elements in a parent group. So if I adjust this to 50 pixels, we can see that the space has adjusted automatically. And I'll change it back to 20 pixels now. If I were to duplicate any of the elements within this group and then I would just to paste it like so, you can see that this new group is added at that same distance of row gap of 20 pixels, and it just allows us to make sure that we apply and maintain uniform spacing. So it saves us time doing that because we programmatically manage the space between elements. Now, the final thing that I want to highlight is gap spacing in row elements. So at the top of the form group over here, we have a row group, which you can see. And this row group has two child input elements, which is the first name and the last name for a user. And in the layout settings, you will see that this one has a row gap and a column gap. Now, the column gap here determines the horizontal space between the child elements. So this space just over here. The row gap, on the other hand, is important for when we adjust the width of the screen. So on a mobile screen, for example, we wouldn't be able to have the inputs next to each other. Instead, this input on the right-hand side will wrap underneath the first name input. And we want to define the gap and make sure that it is consistent when it does wrap underneath. So to show you visually what that looks like, if I go to my responsive tab and just say, I have it like this, as I adjust it, we can see that the last name wraps underneath the first name. So we need to make sure that that row gap is consistent with the other row gaps. Hence we've set it to be 20 pixels, and just make sure that we have a really clean and responsive design. Now, there you have it. What we've covered in this video is the differences between padding, margins, and gap spacing, including when you should be using each. By mastering these settings, you can create more organized and visually appealing designs in Bubble.